On March 14, 1978, at approximately 11:47 in the evening, a maintenance worker named Robert Chen pushed open the heavy steel door of the walk-in freezer at a Burger King restaurant on Georgia Avenue in Silver Spring, Maryland. The temperature inside read -8 degrees Fahrenheit. Chen had worked the closing shift for 6 months, and he knew the rhythm of that freezer the way a pianist knows the weight of ivory keys. He knew which shelves groaned under the weight of frozen patty boxes, which corner accumulated the most frost, and exactly how long he could stand inside before his fingers went numb. What he did not know, and what he would not fully understand until FBI agents appeared at his apartment 3 days later, was that the freezer he cleaned every Tuesday night had been serving as a dead drop for Soviet intelligence communications for at least 14 months. The discovery happened by accident, the way most revelations do during wartime that never officially declares itself. Chen was scraping ice buildup from the rear wall when his putty knife struck something that did not sound like concrete or insulation. It was a metallic echo, thin and hollow, like tapping on the lid of a coffee can. He stopped. The fluorescent tube overhead flickered with that particular frequency that makes everything look slightly unreal, slightly clinical. He scraped again, more deliberately this time, clearing away a section of frost the size of a dinner plate. Beneath it, embedded flush with the wall's surface, was a small metal panel approximately 4 inches square. It had no handle, no obvious mechanism, just a hairline seam that would have been invisible under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. This was 1978. The Cold War had entered what historians would later call its second Cold War phase, a period of renewed tension following the brief détente of the early 70s. Soviet operations on American soil had intensified. The CIA's counterintelligence division was stretched thin, still recovering from the institutional damage of the Church Committee hearings 2 years prior, which had exposed decades of domestic surveillance abuses and left the intelligence community simultaneously hamstrung and paranoid. Chen stared at the panel for what felt like several minutes, but was probably closer to 30 seconds. His breath formed clouds in the frozen air. Somewhere beyond the freezer door, he could hear the muffled sounds of his co-worker Denise wiping down the grill station, the radio playing something that sounded like the Bee Gees, the ordinary machinery of an ordinary American night. He reached out with his ungloved hand and touched the metal. It was so cold it burned. He pulled back, then tried again, this time working the edge of his putty knife into the seam. The panel resisted, then suddenly popped free with a soft click. Behind it was a shallow cavity, perhaps 6 inches deep, carved directly into the wall's insulation. Inside the cavity was a small canvas pouch, military green, the kind used for storing ammunition or field rations. The pouch was sealed with a drawstring pulled tight. Chen's first thought was drugs. His second thought was money. His third thought, which came with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with the temperature, was that he should put the panel back and walk away. He did not follow his third thought. He pulled the pouch from the cavity, loosened the drawstring, and looked inside. What he found were not drugs or money, but something far more mundane, and in hindsight, far more dangerous. Rolls of undeveloped film, perhaps 8 or 9 of them, each wrapped in black plastic and labeled with strips of white surgical tape marked with numbers and letters that meant nothing to him. There were also several folded sheets of what appeared to be onion skin paper, the kind used for carbon copies, covered in handwritten text he could not immediately decipher. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical, with none of the casual loops and flourishes of personal correspondence. It looked official. It looked wrong. Chen replaced the pouch exactly as he had found it, fitted the panel back into its slot, and left the freezer. He finished his shift without mentioning the discovery to anyone. He went home to his 1-bedroom apartment in Tacoma Park, sat on his second-hand couch, and tried to decide what he had just become complicit in. The next morning, he called in sick to work and spent 6 hours sitting in the reading room of the Silver Spring Library, looking through back issues of the Washington Post for any mention of espionage, Soviet activity, dead drops, or anything that might help him understand what he had stumbled into. He found nothing useful, only the usual Cold War background noise. Arms control negotiations stalling in Geneva, Soviet troop movements in Afghanistan, American anxieties about neutron bombs and nuclear parity. By the evening of the second day, Chen had convinced himself that he was overreacting, that the hidden compartment was probably just some employee's amateur smuggling operation, nothing more sinister than stolen inventory or a small-time drug stash. He was wrong. On March 17th, 3 days after his discovery, 2 men in dark suits appeared at his door. They showed him identification that looked real, but moved with the rehearsed efficiency of people who had done this many times before. They asked if he would mind answering a few questions. They asked about his shift schedule. They asked about the freezer. They asked if he had noticed anything unusual. Chen, who had never been good at lying, told them everything. The men listened without interrupting, taking notes in small, leather-bound notebooks. When he finished, one of them asked if Chen had touched the pouch or examined its contents. Chen said yes. The man nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already knew, and asked if Chen would be willing to accompany them to a nearby office to provide a more detailed statement. It was not really a question. What Chen learned over the next 8 hours, sitting in a windowless room in an unmarked building in downtown Washington, was that the Burger King on Georgia Avenue had been under intermittent surveillance by the FBI's Washington field office since January of the previous year. The surveillance had been part of a larger counterintelligence operation targeting suspected Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet embassy on Wisconsin Avenue. The operation, codenamed Distant Thunder, had been tracking the movements of a mid-level Soviet diplomat named Yuri Alexandrovich Volkov, who was believed to be a case officer for the KGB's Line KR, responsible for counterintelligence operations abroad. Volkov had been observed making irregular visits to various commercial establishments throughout the Maryland suburbs, including the Burger King in question, always alone, always briefly, and always during off-peak hours. The FBI had suspected that Volkov was servicing dead drops, but had been unable to determine the exact locations or timing without risking exposure of their surveillance. Chen's accidental discovery had solved half of that problem. The freezer compartment was almost certainly a dead drop, a physical location used to pass information between a case officer and an asset without direct contact. The method was old, dating back to the earliest days of the Cold War, but it remained effective precisely because of its simplicity. A case officer could load the drop with instructions or payment, signal its readiness through some predetermined method, and depart. The asset would retrieve the contents at a completely different time, minimizing the risk of surveillance teams connecting the two individuals. The Burger King location was particularly clever. Fast food restaurants operated on predictable schedules with high employee turnover and minimal security. A customer loitering in the dining area would attract no attention. An employee accessing the freezer would be invisible. The only vulnerability was exactly what had happened: routine maintenance exposing the mechanism. The FBI agents questioning Chen explained all of this with the weary patience of men who had seen too many operations unravel for want of a single mistake. They asked Chen to describe the contents of the pouch in exact detail. They asked about the film canisters, the onion skin paper, the markings on the surgical tape. They asked if he had disturbed anything, moved anything, taken anything. Chen said no, he had replaced everything exactly as he found it. The agents exchanged glances. One of them left the room and returned 20 minutes later with a different man, older, with the kind of face that suggested he had spent decades learning to reveal nothing. This man introduced himself only as Mitchell and asked Chen if he would be willing to help the Bureau conduct what he called a controlled retrieval operation. Chen asked what that meant. Mitchell said it meant going back to work as if nothing had happened, maintaining his normal routine and waiting for instructions. Chen asked what would happen if he refused. Mitchell said nothing for several seconds, then suggested that refusing would be inadvisable for reasons he was not at liberty to discuss, but which Chen should consider carefully. Chen returned to work the following Tuesday. His shift supervisor, a man named Gary, who had been with the company for 7 years and took genuine pride in the cleanliness of his restaurant, asked if Chen was feeling better. Chen said yes. Gary said good, because they were short-staffed and the area manager was coming for an inspection on Friday. Chen nodded and began his usual duties. At 10:30 that evening, after the dining room had closed and the other employees had clocked out, Chen entered the freezer alone. He had been instructed to check the compartment and report immediately if anything had changed. He worked the panel free with the same putty knife, opened the cavity, and found it empty. The canvas pouch was gone. Someone had serviced the drop. Over the next 6 weeks, Chen became an unwilling participant in an intelligence operation he barely understood. The FBI installed pinhole cameras in the freezer's ceiling, disguised as ventilation fixtures. They wired Chen with a recording device the size of a cigarette pack that pressed against his lower back beneath his uniform shirt. They instructed him to maintain his exact routine, changing nothing, drawing no attention. Every Tuesday night, Chen checked the compartment. Sometimes it was empty. Sometimes it contained the green canvas pouch. When the pouch appeared, Chen would leave the freezer, complete his closing duties, and drive directly to a predetermined location: a parking garage in Bethesda, a rest stop on Interstate 270, a church parking lot in Rockville, where he would meet with FBI handlers who would debrief him about what he had observed. The meetings were always brief, always after midnight, always conducted with the engine running and the radio playing softly to mask their conversation. Chen learned that the drop was being serviced approximately every 11 to 14 days, suggesting an active operation with regular communication requirements. He learned that the FBI had identified at least 3 different individuals who visited the Burger King during relevant time windows, though they had not yet determined which of them was the asset. He learned that the contents of the pouch had been carefully documented through the ceiling cameras and included not only film and written documents but also, on 2 occasions, small amounts of cash in $20 and $50 bills, and once, inexplicably, a woman's wedding ring. He learned that the KGB's technique for signaling a loaded drop involved Volkov purchasing a specific item from the restaurant, a Whopper with cheese, no pickles, extra onions, and leaving it uneaten on a particular table in the dining area. The signal was invisible to anyone who did not know to look for it, and it confirmed what counterintelligence analysts had suspected for years. The Soviets were using consumer behavior as a communications channel, hiding operational signals in the noise of American commercial life. What Chen did not learn, and what he would not understand until much later, was that he had become expendable the moment he opened that compartment. The FBI's interest in protecting his safety extended exactly as far as his usefulness to their operation. If the KGB discovered that the dead drop had been compromised, standard procedure called for immediately burning the asset, terminating the operation, and disappearing anyone who might lead back to the surveillance effort. Chen was not trained for this kind of work. He had no security clearance, no legal protection, no formal status within the operation. He was, in the clinical language of intelligence work, a developmental asset, meaning someone whose cooperation had been developed through circumstance rather than recruitment, and whose loss would be regrettable but acceptable. The controlled phase of the operation lasted exactly 43 days. On April 29, 1978, Chen arrived for his Tuesday closing shift and found the restaurant in chaos. There had been a small fire in the kitchen earlier that afternoon, nothing serious but enough to trigger the sprinkler system and force a temporary closure for cleanup and inspection. The fire marshal had required a complete inventory of all food storage areas, including the walk-in freezer. Chen felt his stomach drop. He found Gary in the office, reviewing insurance paperwork. Gary looked up and said they would probably be closed for the rest of the week, maybe longer, depending on the inspection results. Chen asked if anyone had accessed the freezer. Gary said yes. The fire marshal's team had been through everything, very thorough, took photographs, the whole procedure. Chen excused himself, went to the employee bathroom, and vomited. He met with his FBI handlers that night in the parking lot of a closed shopping center in Wheaton. He told them about the fire, the inspection, the freezer. The agents listened with expressions that revealed nothing, then made phone calls from a payphone while Chen sat in his car with the heater running against the April chill. When they returned, they told him the operation was being suspended pending assessment. They told him to go home, maintain normal routines, and wait for contact. They told him not to discuss any of this with anyone, including family, friends, or co-workers. They told him that violating operational security would be considered a federal offense. Then they drove away, leaving Chen alone in the empty parking lot with the distinct feeling that he had just been cut loose. The fire at the Burger King was subsequently determined to have been caused by a malfunctioning deep fryer thermostat, a common enough mechanical failure that triggered no particular suspicion. The insurance company paid the claim. The restaurant reopened after 8 days. Chen returned to his normal shift schedule. But the FBI surveillance had been withdrawn, the ceiling cameras removed, the handlers gone silent. Chen checked the freezer compartment on his next Tuesday shift and found it empty, but the panel seemed different somehow, the seam less precise, as if it had been removed and replaced by someone less careful than whoever had originally installed it. He replaced the panel and never checked again. What Chen could not have known, sitting in that frozen room with his breath forming clouds in the air, was that his accidental discovery had triggered a chain of events that would eventually expose one of the most successful Soviet intelligence operations on American soil during the Cold War's second act. The asset servicing the Burger King dead drop was not a low-level diplomat or a recruited ideologue, but a senior analyst at the National Security Agency with access to signals intelligence that detailed American understanding of Soviet military communications. The analyst, whose identity would later be revealed as David Barnett, had been passing classified material to the KGB for nearly 3 years, motivated not by ideology, but by debt, gambling losses, and the quiet desperation of a man who had watched his life slowly collapse while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. The films in the canvas pouch contained photographed documents that would have allowed Soviet military planners to understand exactly how much the United States knew about their nuclear command and control systems, information valuable enough to potentially shift the strategic balance in the event of conflict. The FBI's counterintelligence division had suspected a leak within NSA for 18 months, but had been unable to narrow the pool of potential suspects below several hundred individuals with appropriate access. The Burger King dead drop provided the first concrete link in the operational chain, a physical location that could be monitored, documented, and eventually traced back through the network of handlers and cutouts to the source. But the premature exposure caused by the restaurant fire had forced the FBI to accelerate their timeline, moving from passive surveillance to active investigation before all the elements were in place. This would have consequences. Chen continued working at the Burger King for another 7 months, until November of 1978, when he accepted a job offer from a small accounting firm in Baltimore and left the restaurant business entirely. He was never contacted again by the FBI. He was never asked to testify, never called as a witness, never formally debriefed about his role in the operation. It was as if those 6 weeks had been erased from official record, deleted from memory, filed away in some basement archive where uncomfortable truths go to decompose quietly. Chen would later describe this period as the loneliest of his life, not because he was physically alone, but because he carried knowledge he could never share, answers to questions he could never ask, and the growing certainty that he had been used and discarded by systems that owed him nothing and would acknowledge him never. The arrest of David Barnett occurred on October 23, 1978, at 7:15 in the morning, as he was leaving his townhouse in Columbia, Maryland, heading to his car with a travel mug of coffee and a briefcase containing nothing more incriminating than budget reports and a half-eaten sandwich from the previous day. The FBI had been watching him for 6 weeks by that point, ever since a separate surveillance operation had photographed him making brief contact with a known KGB officer outside a metro station in DuPont Circle. The contact had lasted less than 10 seconds. A brush pass so subtle that it might have been accidental. 2 men colliding in a crowd and apologizing, except that the FBI's analysts had reviewed the footage frame by frame and determined that something small, possibly a film canister, had been transferred from Barnett's hand to the Soviet officer's pocket. This was the final confirmation they needed. Combined with financial records, showing unexplained cash deposits, pattern analysis of his access to classified materials that had subsequently appeared in Soviet military assessments, and the physical evidence from the Burger King dead drop operation. They had sufficient grounds for arrest. Barnett did not resist. He did not run. He simply stood beside his car in the weak autumn sunlight and waited while agents read him his rights and placed handcuffs on his wrists with a gentleness that felt almost respectful, as if they understood that the real violence had already occurred months or years earlier, in whatever moment of moral collapse had transformed him from analyst to traitor. His neighbors, leaving for their own morning commutes, watched from windows and driveways with expressions that ranged from confusion to horror to a kind of grim satisfaction that something interesting had finally happened on their quiet suburban street. One woman, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret Henshaw, who lived 3 doors down, would later tell a Washington Post reporter that Barnett had always seemed like such a polite young man, always said hello, always shoveled his walkway after snow, never caused any trouble at all. She would say this with the particular bewilderment of someone discovering that normalcy is not a defense against betrayal, that evil does not announce itself with dramatic music and visible horns. The interrogation lasted 4 days. It took place in a secure facility in Northern Virginia, whose exact location was never specified in official records. Barnett was offered deals, threatened with consequences, presented with evidence that ranged from genuinely damning to circumstantially suggestive. The FBI's strategy was textbook: establish rapport, create cognitive dissonance, offer paths to redemption that narrowed with each passing hour. Barnett's attorney, a public defender named Sarah Weinstein, who had been assigned to the case and who understood immediately that she was representing a man who had already lost, advised him to cooperate fully in exchange for a reduced sentence. Barnett refused. Not because he maintained his innocence, the evidence was overwhelming and he knew it, but because he had been promised by his KGB handlers that if he ever faced arrest, they would arrange for his extraction, bring him to Moscow, give him a new identity and a comfortable life behind the curtain he had served so faithfully. He was waiting for rescue that would never come. The KGB had already written him off. This is the part that people outside intelligence work rarely understand, the arithmetic brutality of it. Barnett was not a valuable asset worth risking additional operations to save. He was a compromised resource whose usefulness had ended the moment FBI agents appeared at his door. Standard procedure dictated immediate separation, burning any operational connections that might lead back to other agents still in place. Yuri Volkov, the case officer who had recruited and run Barnett, had been quietly recalled to Moscow 3 days before the arrest, officially reassigned for routine rotation, but actually removed from the field before American counterintelligence could build a prosecutable case against him. The dead drop at the Burger King had been abandoned. The cutouts and intermediaries who had facilitated communications had either been evacuated or instructed to sever all contact. Barnett was alone, sitting in an interrogation room decorated in the bland, institutional style of government buildings everywhere, slowly realizing that the promises he had believed in were as empty as the canvas pouch Chen had found in that freezer. On the 4th day, Barnett began talking. He described his recruitment, which had occurred not through ideological seduction, but through financial desperation. He had accumulated significant gambling debts, $23,000 owed to various bookmakers who were losing patience with his excuses. A man had approached him at a bar in Baltimore, someone who seemed to know about his situation in uncomfortable detail and had offered a simple transaction. Information in exchange for cash, one time only, no obligations beyond that. Barnett had told himself it was not really betrayal, that the documents he provided were not particularly sensitive, that he could stop any time he wanted. These are the lies we tell ourselves when crossing lines we know cannot be uncrossed. The one-time transaction became regular payments. The moderately sensitive documents became highly classified assessments. The man at the bar introduced him to others, and the operation formalized into the structured tradecraft of dead drops, signal sites, and compartmented communications. By the time Barnett understood the full scope of what he had become involved in, extrication seemed impossible. He owed them now, not money, but something far less fungible: his complicity. The information Barnett provided during his confession allowed the FBI to map a network of Soviet intelligence activities that extended far beyond his individual case. He identified meeting locations, described communication protocols, named individuals he had encountered who might be KGB officers operating undercover. The intelligence value of his cooperation was significant enough that prosecutors agreed to recommend a reduced sentence in exchange for his full testimony. On February 12, 1979, in a closed courtroom with no media present and no public record of the proceedings, David Barnett pled guilty to multiple counts of espionage. He was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. He would serve 11 years before being released on parole in 1990, emerging into an America that had moved on, a Cold War that was ending, and a world that had no place for him. He died in 2003, living under an assumed name in a small town in Oregon, working as a night manager at a grocery store, speaking to no one about his past. Robert Chen learned about Barnett's arrest from a newspaper article 6 months after leaving the Burger King. He was sitting in his new office in Baltimore, eating lunch at his desk, when he came across a small item in the Metro section of the Post about a former NSA analyst being sentenced for espionage. The article mentioned a dead drop at a commercial location in Maryland, but provided no specific details. Chen felt something cold settle in his chest, a recognition that arrives not as surprise, but as confirmation of things already suspected. He thought about the freezer, the canvas pouch, the FBI agents who had used him and then disappeared. He thought about the fact that his accidental discovery had probably saved lives, prevented some unnamed catastrophe, contributed to national security in ways he would never fully understand or receive credit for. He also thought about the fact that he had been placed at risk without informed consent, manipulated by systems that saw him as disposable and then discarded when his usefulness ended. Both things could be true simultaneously. This is the moral ambiguity that defines intelligence work, the necessity of treating human beings as assets, the calculation that some risks are acceptable when measured against abstract threats to national security. Chen never spoke publicly about his role in the operation. He was never debriefed in any formal way, never asked to sign non-disclosure agreements, never offered compensation or recognition. The FBI's handling of his involvement represented what intelligence professionals call plausible deniability, the practice of structuring operations so that if things go wrong, no official record exists to prove institutional knowledge or responsibility. If Chen had been injured or killed during the 6 weeks he was checking that dead drop, there would have been no paper trail connecting him to federal operations. His death would have been ruled accidental, his family would have received no explanation, and the investigation would have quietly concluded that he was simply an unfortunate victim of random violence or bad luck. This is not speculation or paranoia, but documented procedure, the way these operations are designed to protect institutions at the expense of individuals. The Burger King on Georgia Avenue remained open until 1994, when it was demolished to make way for a condominium development. During those 16 years, it operated as an ordinary fast food restaurant, serving ordinary customers who had no idea that the walk-in freezer had once been the transfer point for some of the most sensitive intelligence the Soviet Union obtained during the Cold War's second phase. The compartment behind the rear wall was never officially removed or documented in building records. It is possible that construction workers discovered it during demolition and assumed it was some remnant of old plumbing or electrical work. It is also possible that it remains buried somewhere beneath the foundation of the condominiums that now occupy that space. A small metal cavity sealed forever inside concrete and earth, a monument to secrets that no longer matter because the war they served has ended. The story of the Burger King dead drop exists now primarily in classified FBI files that will likely remain sealed for decades. Some details emerged through Freedom of Information Act requests filed by journalists and researchers interested in Cold War intelligence operations, but the full scope of the operation remains obscured by redactions and exemptions. What we know comes from fragments, declassified surveillance logs, trial transcripts with names removed, Interviews with retired agents willing to discuss cases that have passed beyond the statute of limitations for prosecution. These fragments suggest an operation that was simultaneously sophisticated in its execution and fragile in its security, successful in its outcomes, but compromised by the kind of random chance that no amount of planning can eliminate. A maintenance worker's putty knife striking metal in a freezer. A moment of curiosity that cascaded into exposure. The deeper truth, the one that makes this story worth remembering beyond its operational details, is what it reveals about the nature of the Cold War itself. This was not a conflict of armies massing on borders or fleets engaging in open ocean. It was a war fought in restaurant freezers and suburban parking lots, waged by people who looked like anyone else, and whose betrayals occurred not through dramatic acts of violence, but through quiet transactions hidden inside the machinery of ordinary life. David Barnett did not plant bombs or assassinate officials. He photographed documents and left them in a canvas pouch for someone else to collect. Robert Chen did not storm enemy positions or defuse explosives. He scraped ice from a freezer wall and accidentally discovered a secret that changed nothing and everything simultaneously. Both men were pulled into operations far larger than themselves, used by systems that cared about outcomes rather than individuals, and then set adrift when the moment passed. The Cold War produced thousands of stories like this, small dramas of compromise and consequence that occurred away from public view, documented in files that gathered dust in government archives, remembered by aging men and women who signed agreements promising they would never speak of what they saw or did. Some of these stories ended with arrests and trials. Others simply dissolved into ambiguity, unresolved questions about who was loyal and who was not, which suspicions were justified and which were paranoia, what actually happened versus what was officially recorded. The people involved in these operations, the analysts who betrayed their trust, the handlers who ran them, the accidental witnesses who stumbled into operations they barely understood, carried their knowledge into ordinary lives, becoming accountants and grocery store managers and retirees who played cards and watched television and took their grandchildren to baseball games, all while holding secrets that could never be shared, questions that could never be asked, guilt that could never be absolved, because there was no one left who remembered enough to grant forgiveness. This is what makes the Cold War different from conventional conflicts. It had no clear beginning and no definitive end, just a gradual accumulation of tensions that eventually exhausted themselves into something resembling peace. It produced no great battle narratives, no decisive turning points where outcomes were determined and heroes emerged. Instead, it generated an endless series of small compromises, minor betrayals, bureaucratic victories and defeats that mattered immensely to the people involved, but barely registered in the broader historical record. The Burger King dead drop was one of thousands of such operations, significant enough to warrant FBI resources, but not important enough to ever become public knowledge, successful enough to result in a conviction, but compromised enough to be considered a partial failure within the intelligence community. Robert Chen died in 2019 at the age of 73, from complications related to pneumonia. His obituary in the Baltimore Sun described him as a retired accountant who enjoyed gardening and volunteered at his local library. It made no mention of the 6 weeks in 1978 when he became part of an intelligence operation that helped expose a Soviet spy. His family had no idea. His co-workers had no idea. The people who attended his funeral and shared memories of his quiet kindness and his terrible jokes and his habit of bringing homemade cookies to office meetings had no idea that he had once stood in a freezer at 11:47 at night and discovered something that would eventually send another man to federal prison. This information died with him, or would have if not for the few documents that survived classification and the handful of former agents willing to discuss cases that are now merely historical curiosities. Fragments of a conflict that seems increasingly remote to generations who never lived under the shadow of potential nuclear annihilation. If stories like this make you reflect on how fragile security really was, how much of our safety depended on chance encounters and random maintenance schedules, consider the fact that these operations are still occurring. The methods have evolved, The technology has advanced, the geopolitical alignments have shifted, but the fundamental dynamics remain unchanged. Intelligence work still requires human beings to make impossible choices, still operates in moral gray zones where right and wrong become questions of perspective rather than absolute values, still produces casualties who receive no recognition and tragedies that generate no headlines. The Cold War may have ended, but the war for information continues, fought by people whose names you will never know, in locations you would never suspect, for reasons that seem both absolutely critical and utterly meaningless, depending on which side of history you occupy. The freezer at that Burger King on Georgia Avenue is gone now, demolished and buried. The secrets it held have either been declassified or remain locked in files that will eventually be destroyed when their retention period expires. The people who serviced it are dead or retired or living anonymous lives that bear no resemblance to their operational past. But the pattern remains, the template that intelligence agencies still follow when running operations that require physical dead drops and human assets, and the coordination of activities across weeks or months. The innovation in the Burger King operation was not its technique, but its location. The recognition that the most secure hiding places are often the most visible, that a restaurant freezer accessed by minimum wage workers is less likely to attract suspicion than a hollow tree in a park or a magnetic key holder under a bridge. This understanding, this application of mundane commercial spaces to clandestine purposes, represents a kind of evolution in tradecraft that the Soviets had mastered and that American counterintelligence had to learn to anticipate. These are not just stories. They are warnings about the price of vigilance, the cost of security, the compromises required to maintain systems that claim to protect us. They are reminders that history is not made only by presidents and generals, but also by maintenance workers and analysts and case officers who make decisions in freezers and parking lots and windowless interrogation rooms, decisions that ripple forward in ways they cannot predict or control. And they are evidence that the past is never really past, that the operations conducted decades ago still shape the institutions and protocols and assumptions that govern intelligence work today, that the mistakes made in 1978 in a Burger King in Silver Spring inform the policies that agents follow now in coffee shops and gas stations and shopping malls, where similar operations continue under different names and different circumstances, but with the same fundamental logic, the same cold mathematics of risk and necessity.